All right. It is mid-March. It is a beautiful, windy, cool, sunny day. We finally have our mornings back. It's bright at 6:30 in the morning. We have nice, long evenings. It's safe to say that winter is finally over. Our guest today is Laurel Beversdorf. Laurel is a strength and conditioning specialist and a yoga instructor, and she's part of the team over at Movement Logic. And Movement Logic is an organization that I think does an absolute great job of confronting a lot of the myths and big claims that we hear in the fitness industry. I think they do an especially good job of interrogating some of the myths that you hear on social media, especially regarding women, women's training with osteoporosis, what they call the menopause industry. So, kind of looking at a lot of the myths and flimflammery that you kind of see in that sphere. Laurel has a really sharp, critical brain. I mean that in a good way. She just does a great job of cutting through all the sort of dubious claims that you hear on social media, which is one of the reasons I want to get her on. This is a really good conversation. I really enjoyed it. We spent a lot of time talking about barriers presented to women who want to engage in any kind of strength training. She talked a lot about disempowering narratives, a lot of the mechanisms that can rob women and people in general of their agency when they want to get started with strength training. Then we also talked about some specifics regarding training with osteoporosis and getting that balance right between fear and actually going out and doing something. So this is a really nice episode. I hope you enjoy it. Talk later.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, I am here today with Laurel Beversdorf. Laurel is a certified strength conditioning specialist, and she is also a yoga teacher. And I found her, actually, Jill. Jill let me know about Laurel through her podcast that she does, Movement Logic, and it's also, I guess, her brand and her organization. They do all kinds of things. They've got a great social media presence. And as soon as I saw their content online, I thought, oh, I need to get Laurel and Sarah on because they do such a great job, I think, of demystifying a lot of fitness myths and also just, I think, addressing perhaps a lot of issues that I've noticed in the fitness industry. So if you don't listen to their podcast, I'm going to say right away, make sure you go ahead and subscribe to it because it is excellent and they have a really good backlog of podcasts. But Laurel, thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, Laurel's already seen the series of questions that I gave her way too many questions on the on the prep sheet because there's a lot I wanted to get through because they've covered so much. But I'll let you just begin by just talking a little bit about yourself. So Laurel, who are you and how'd you get here?
I am Laurel Beversdorf, and I am currently in Huntsville, Alabama, by way of New York City, by way of Wisconsin. And I went to college to be an actor, got interested in yoga, New York City, did some acting, became a yoga teacher. And then we had a lot of pain and injuries from only doing yoga. Had a long athletic background in high school, and so didn't have nearly as many aches and pains and injuries while playing high impact, or not high impact, but impact sports, and then started doing lots of yoga and started to have some really debilitating hip and sacroiliac joint pain. So that made me turn away, not leave, but turn away from the yoga community for more answers and to try to solve this problem, which I thought yoga was causing, and got into strength training. And strength training, you know, I don't think this is true for everyone, but it almost immediately resolved the issues within like a couple of weeks. But probably the most important thing that happened when I turned away from the yoga community for, new information was that I left what I believe was probably an echo chamber and stepped outside of ways of thinking to think in new ways and to learn new things. And I said I didn't leave the yoga community. I certainly didn't, but I brought back to the yoga community a lot of things that I had learned from strength and conditioning and started to integrate. And then the pandemic hit, and I transitioned all of my business to online, started a membership, started teaching kettlebells, started teaching strength training alongside my yoga classes, and really embraced the multidisciplinary approach to teaching. Um, Found Sarah Court through a yoga company and found her to be delightful, smart, and funny. And yeah, around 2017, started working with her and some other experts in the yoga and Pilates worlds on movement logic. And then Sarah and I decided right around, I think it was like 2021, that we wanted to move fully into strength training. And so we started our barbell course, which is called Lift for Longevity. And we have generally around 50 to 100 women between the ages of 50, no, sorry, between the ages of like 30 and 70 who sign up to do barbells with us. It's just our strength training program. It's 6 months live online classes from their homes via Zoom. They're lifting barbells in their living rooms with us. And that's kind of our main bread and butter business. But then, as you mentioned, we also have our podcast and we have our Instagram page, The Movement Logic, and Movement Logic Strong Opinions, loosely held, is the name of our podcast, where we get into a lot of topics, a wide range of topics. And these topics sort of live and intersect in areas of exercise, physical therapy, feminism, um, neoliberal capitalism, and yeah, I think those are the big four, probably. Yeah. So that's how I got here, and that's, I think, how y'all found us is through movement logic.
It's funny how often on an ostensibly wellness and fitness podcast I use the word neoliberalism
Mhm.
because it is one of these sort of background I don't know background frameworks that I think if you apply that lens, it does make a lot of sense of the fitness industry and everything
Mm.
we're gonna talk about today. So
Yeah.
you talked about the genesis of movement logic,
Mm.
and I thought you gave some good context, but I just kind of like to ask you directly what when you were developing movement logic as an idea as a brand,
Mhm.
what were you trying to address? What were some issues that you saw in messaging or the culture or social media, in the fitness industry that you specifically wanted to try to address and mitigate?
I like to think of movement logic as having two main eras. There was the era in which we were speaking mostly to yoga and Pilates teachers and giving them more mobility based tools to address painful conditions in their students within scope of practice. So we have Sarah, who's a physical therapist, as a founder of Movement Logic, guiding a lot of that appropriate scope of practice prescription. And I wouldn't even say prescription is the right word. That's a word that's used a lot in strength and conditioning with programming prescription. But with these yoga and movement teachers, yoga, Pilates, or just movement teachers, what we as yoga and Pilates and movement teachers at Movement Logic were running up against as teachers was students coming to us with conditions and pain and looking to us for help. And then wondering, well, how can I think about movement in a way that's less about following rules and regurgitating what I learned in teacher training, which, you know, tends to be a little bit overly simplistic and scripted and doesn't actually give you the thinking tools. It gives you sort of this like kind of shorthand way of oversimplifying your advice to students. And how can we get people, as from Movement Logic's perspective, how can we get these teachers to think bigger about pain, get them to think bigger about movement, and get them to understand what are some pretty well established scientific mm, guidelines that can help us like be better at handling thinking about pain, that can get us to be better at handling thinking about how movement is a solution for pain. And then how can we work with each individual and go, well, okay, based on what you're explaining to me and telling me, Here's what I can offer you within scope of practice as a movement teacher to get you moving in a way that might actually be beneficial for you. That was the first era of movement logic. Then Sarah and I kind of branched off on our own and went, you know what, this is cool. We like teaching yoga and Pilates teachers, but you know what? We're not actually teaching them what we now really think they need, which is they don't need more mobility drills. They need to be stronger. And so imparting a strength program on a group of people is not something you can do in a 3-hour tutorial, which is what we were selling before and what we were building before. It's actually something that needs to be ongoing over the course of many weeks and months because that's the time course we need for strength. And so, I'm a CSCS, Sarah's a physical therapist. We're like, let's create a program. And so now what are we going to put in it? Well, we notice that a lot of the people in these communities, yoga and Pilates, are women. And we notice that they're older. And we notice that yoga and Pilates is all they do. And if they're handed a weight or if they pick up a weight, it tends to be small and it tends to be fluorescent in color. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to actually swing all the way over to the other side and we're going to create a barbell course because that is the exact opposite of how these women see themselves lifting weights. And we feel like we're uniquely positioned as insiders in both of these communities, the strength training community as well as within the yoga and Pilates community, to be translators, to say, hey, why not try this? And here are the benefits of this. And here's why this is going to be a more effective way for you to actually get stronger, improve your bone density, which was another thing that people were very concerned about at the time. A lot of yoga and Pilates teachers were getting their DEXA scans and coming back as osteopenic, osteoporotic, and very disillusioned because they were told that yoga and Pilates were all they needed, that yoga and Pilates would build bone, that yoga and Pilates were basically strength training, right? And so we're like, listen, we know these are the problems you're facing. We know who you are because we were you and we still are you. And here's what you need to understand. And here's a tool. We chose barbells. We could have chose dumbbells. We could have chosen, machines at the gym. We could have created a program using all of the tools of strength training. We chose barbells. We picked a lane because we wanted people to have this equipment in their homes. We knew that this community of people were reticent to go to the gym. They did not like the idea of going to the gym for the various reasons that, we can talk about, but largely because gyms tend to be rather unfriendly places for older women for a variety of reasons. And also, there's assumptions made about where women should be in the gym, right? That are deeply ingrained in both the women that are there as well as the, people taking the women on tours of the gym is like, okay, here's the cardio machines and here's the yoga room and this is where you're going to go, right? So we wanted women with barbells in their homes where they would feel completely comfortable with this equipment that they've long associated with, the thing that young men lift. And we wanted to walk them step by step over the course of a 6-month course and how to actually pick up heavy barbells eventually, right? So we don't start heavy. No one starts heavy, but to walk them through the process of starting with light weights, building up to moderate, and eventually by the end of 6 months, picking up some objectively heavy weights in some of those, multi-joint lifts like the deadlift, the squat, right? And so that was the second era of movement logic, and that's kind of the era that we're currently fully living in. We're also currently working on a course right now about power. So, force at speed, creating, being strong while moving quickly or moving powerfully, right? Which is producing force with some speed behind it. Why are we moving to power? Because we know that people are concerned about bone density, but more than anything, they're actually concerned about fracture. Okay. And so one of the most evidence-based ways to improve balance is to improve someone's power. So we're addressing the strength and the bone density needs through Lift for Longevity, and then addressing the ability to move quickly, right? To catch yourself before you fall, as well as to just move in ways that we associate, I think, a lot of times with life's greatest adventures, with moving with joy and expressiveness. Um, you know, power, the ability to continue to move with speed, with agility, with an ability to move quickly, basically. So yeah, that's hopefully I answered your question about how I got here, and really like where the movement logic's work currently is living, which is in the realms of strength and conditioning, basically.
You said a lot of good things in that response, and I guess there's really two that I want to address. Number one, when you said that you kind of left the yoga community for a while, or you didn't leave, but you started to explore other modalities of training, and then you brought back ideas about strength training. Did you find that has there been any pushback at all, or have you found that in general people tend to be really receptive to this idea of incorporating strength training into other modalities like Pilates and yoga?
It's a mixed bag, and I guess it depends on how it's done. I have personally not experienced a ton of pushback, probably because of the algorithm, probably because the people who see my work are the people who have, in various ways voted to see it on Instagram, right? Which is where I am um, in communication with my community initially. Like that's where they tend to find me, that and probably on podcasts. I've done a fair number of podcast interviews as well. But yeah, so when I started bringing strength training principles to yoga, um, they didn't change really how the yoga class looked. It really was more of a shift in how I chose my words and also the advice that I gave my students after class when they came to me with questions about their inability to do a pose or about some maybe sensitivities that they were experiencing because maybe all they did was yoga. It's changed how I communicated with them around like what a well-rounded um, exposure to movement based practices maybe should look more like, right? Which is like maybe we need to start incorporating some strength training in addition to the yoga you're doing. A lot of the times that was probably the biggest way that strength training and being exposed to the science of strength training and the communities surrounding or in which they were communities of strength training, right, which I encountered through a number of different avenues. But this idea that we don't get strong on accident. We don't get strong just because we're active a lot. We get strong when we deliberately expose ourselves to loads that push the threshold of our strength on a weekly basis. And those, loads are dosed sufficiently and appropriately. Um, so that was a big one. And then I also developed a way of practicing yoga with resistance bands, which I called yoga with resistance bands, but was very uh, careful not to call it strength training. In fact, a whole huge part of my teacher training was about what strength training is, what yoga is as a physical practice, so what asana is, and then how resistance bands are used in both of these ways of moving for toward different ends. Um, Resistance bands are just a way of loading the body, basically, but we can use the tool of a resistance band to facilitate the goals of yoga, and then we can use a resistance band to facilitate the goals of strength training. And the goals of yoga and the goals of strength training are actually quite different. We use resistance bands in my yoga teacher training predominantly to heighten proprioception, to increase this felt sense of embodiment through the application of external load, but also touch, right? We wore the resistance bands on our bodies. So the band would actually be contacting certain parts of the body, like, for example, the rib cage, which is incredibly difficult to sense. But when you have a band wrapped around your rib cage, it's actually really much easier to feel your ribs moving, which is pretty cool. various ways of heightening body awareness in yoga, but then also ways of making yoga poses actually easier because resistance bands can be assistance bands. Ways of bringing pulling into the practice. So that's where we maybe started to drift a little bit more toward like deliberately bringing in strength training. But I could never call yoga with resistance bands strength training because one of the most important principles of strength training is progressive overload. And in my opinion, when you try to systematically, progressively overload a group of muscles in a yoga class over the course of weeks and months, it kind of loses the enjoyment of a yoga class, which I feel is that, first of all, there's different students in your yoga class, probably. And that's kind of cool. I like that part. I like that different people are showing up, right? All the time, right? So you don't have this consistent group of people week in and week out. That right there makes progressive overload impossible. Okay. Number two is I don't feel that getting stronger should be even one of the primary goals of practicing yoga because number one, it's not a great tool for it. And number two, it's just so much better at other things. Right. So let's use yoga as the physical practice is predominantly what I'm referring to here for the things that it's really, really good at. Right. Which I think that it's really, really good at heightening body awareness, providing an environment in which people can actually move mindfully and almost meditate on the felt sense of movement. It's a quiet atmosphere. Usually, or a more meditative atmosphere, and it's an introspective practice, right? It's less about doing things to the environment and more about noticing what's happening internally. And I think that these are some of the most powerful um, ways that yoga asana positively influences people. So as soon as we then start making it about performance of strength, when we start making it about um, producing force in ways that probably should start to feel uncomfortable if we're trying to make a change for us, it loses all of what I think makes yoga special. But so this yoga with resistance band is like where I kind of got close to bringing resistance training tools into the yoga practice, but not really to make yoga resistance training, right? And then I also have a course on my website, which is how to teach kettlebells in a yoga class. And I had a whole thing, where I had this free course people could sign up for and try bringing sets of strength training exercises into a yoga practice and how to do that intelligently so that the yoga doesn't fatigue the muscles you're targeting for strength and how the muscles you're targeting for strength um, can be targeted, sufficiently within, a 30 to 45-minute class. Um, and that was my response to this problem that I just continue to notice, which is that people just don't want to strength train. They want people being largely like women in their 50s and 60s love yoga and they don't want to strength train. But what if I can have them strength train within their yoga practice as like literally we're going to stop doing asana right now and we're going to do a set of squats holding a kettlebell. But then all of the asana you do around that three sets of squats within this practice, and it's probably only one or two exercises within an entire practice. How can we make it so that the practice complements the squat pattern? And how can we make it so that the squat pattern connects to the practice? And how can we make it mindful in the sense that we're used to thinking of mindfulness in yoga, right? I think strength training is incredibly mindful, by the way, and it's all about listening to your body, really, truly. But the way that we practice mindfulness in yoga, I think feels different. Um, and the way that we practice mindfulness in strength training leaves us feeling different, right? So yeah, and those are just a couple of the ways that I started to blend. I didn't get much pushback back to your original question. I think because of the algorithm, I think that if I were on a bigger stage, right, I would get a ton more pushback. I'm sure that there would be people, accusing me of cultural appropriation or people suggesting that, I'm not really practicing yoga and all of these things, right? I call it being hit with the not yoga stick. I'm cool with it. I'm confident enough in my background as a yoga teacher for now 20 years. Um, I'm confident enough in my own humility and ability to recognize that, yeah, I'm a white woman who teaches yoga. Yes, I tend to emphasize the physical aspects of yoga much more. It doesn't mean that I don't have any background into the spiritual practices of yoga. I just don't pretend that I'm an expert in those areas. I definitely don't position myself as somebody who has any like unique or special insights in those areas. I'm much, much more of a student of those topics. Um, I do think that yoga as a spiritual practice has been dumbed down a lot for the West, but I don't think that the dumbing down of yoga, um, in the sense that it's been stripped of a lot of its cultural and spiritual meaning, has, you know, I don't think that that has been as much of a negative as people would like to suggest it is. I think that I think that maybe yoga is kind of something totally different here. And I think that if we can recognize that with honesty and humility and realize that like yeah, I'm definitely not someone who, grew up with yoga being taught in the home. I have very limited exposure to the texts of yoga. I did teach it in teacher training. I mean, I had to understand the sutras pretty well because I had to teach it to, multiple groups of teacher trainees. But yeah, I guess I don't get as much pushback, probably because of the algorithm. If I did get pushback, I would be like, okay, um, if this isn't yoga, like what is yoga and how do you know whether or not someone is practicing yoga? Because that really the only way that we can know if someone is practicing yoga is if we can read their mind. Like, right? What are you experiencing while engaging in one of these practices of yoga, which is asana, but maybe also pranayama, right? Where are your intentions? What kind of experience are you having spiritually right now? There's no way anyone from the outside looking in can know that about anyone. So in many ways, I think people who do carry around the not yoga stick, I think actually what they're doing is just exerting some form of control over the practice. And oftentimes the people doing it are white women.
Yeah, there's a lot of funny gatekeeping and all, all these different practices,
Yes.
especially anytime,
Gatekeeping is a
we
perfect
talk
word.
about, purity or we talk about lineage, and that's not unique to yoga. We could look at other modalities. Yeah, it's interesting. You're right. I mean, there's almost no way that yoga could mean the same thing practiced in the West by someone in 2026 as it might have meant, in the past in India or even in Indian communities now. And, then it's like you said, there's that whole extra layer of commodification and packaging and trying to turn things into products. Yeah, it's sort of impossible. And as with all things, when we talk about ideas like this, everyone has their own little definition. It's all, blindfolded people sort of touching the elephant, grabbing on the trunk, the tail, whatever. Right? Everyone has this different experience. You kind of alluded to it. You're sort of talking about this gendered aspect in fitness and wellness. And I think you correctly identified what most people have noticed as well, that for whatever reason, strength training, progressive strength training, weightlifting, even bodybuilding, powerlifting, different practices of that, they tend people assume that they code male, and I think that probably bears out in the statistics as well. But I want to get your take on this. So there does seem to be this gendered aspect, and I'm just going to say fitness as shorthand. And I think it happens at different levels, at the social level in terms of expectations, sort of the individual emotional or psychological level, and then also just at the practical level in terms of having the knowledge and things to participate in this. So, I mean, I'd kind of like to get your take on it. What do you think are the barriers? And you can take this in any direction you want that are currently preventing women from engaging in progressive strength training.
Well, I do think that there is the very real barrier of time. I think that we can't have a conversation about inequality without talking about the unfair distribution of labor, which happens in this case in the home. I do think that it's still true that women bear the brunt of duties around the home, duties with the children, in addition to now also working full time. So, I saw it with my own mother, and if we can just do N of one anecdotal here, she was a public school English teacher and she had 3 kids, and she cooked for us every night. She made breakfast for me every morning. I was an English teacher, okay, so that means she's coming home with papers to grade. So she's not just clocking in and clocking out at school, she's coming home with papers to grade. And, she's cleaning the house. She's, taking care of all of our needs around school, making sure that we have what we need, taking us shopping, things that we need for sports and whatnot. My dad was a school administrator, but from my perspective, had a lot more leisure time than my mom. A lot more time spent outside golfing. Okay, so he's getting a little bit of exercise there. A lot more time watching TV. Okay, so my mom would go on walks every once in a while, but not nearly as often as she felt that she should, and probably not nearly as often as she should, right? She didn't engage in any form of strength training, which I don't think is uncommon for her generation. But, I saw that growing up and realized because I'm of a different generation, but also, I left Wisconsin to go to school in upstate New York, where it's a little bit more liberal. The culture is a little bit more different. The gender roles are a little bit more blended, right? And then moved to New York City, where it's even much more so that like there isn't this clear separation. For context, I grew up in a small rural area of Wisconsin, so much more conservative. There isn't this clear separation between like how men and women spend their time, right? And gradually over time, because I was very active my whole life and have continued to exercise for my entire life, you know, value exercise, value physical activity, and realize that like I have to make time for it. It's a priority. So I think women, in many respects, are strapped with a lot of more work than their male counterparts. Those in heterosexual relationships, and then and that's not always the case. I mean, I can really confidently tell you that my husband and I are pretty equal here, but you know, that's I don't think the norm. And we're living in Alabama right now, and I can tell you for sure it's not the norm because we still have terms here in Alabama like team mom or, the groups that are in charge of the kids are usually the mothers, right? The people, overwhelmingly, I think the people volunteering in the schools are the mothers, right? So and maybe it's because they don't work, right? I don't know, but what I can tell you is that it's currently, there's a distribution of labor that makes it so that women often don't have time to exercise, okay? And then in addition to that, another barrier is that women have been indoctrinated to believe that the sole reason that they should exercise is for weight loss. But then they've been given a lot of really confusing and incorrect information around how weight loss occurs. So, one of them, the most insidious and hard to kill thought viruses out there, is that we can spot reduce fat, which is this idea that if we just do a lot of crunches, we'll get abs. Okay, or if we just do, a lot of toning or sculpting of the arms or the thighs or the butt, you know, we will somehow mold our bodies like clay into a desirable shape and appearance for the male gaze, right? And it always kind of comes back to, how we can look better, usually smaller, for probably social status, but ultimately, who's the arbiter of that? It's white men predominantly, right? So because they're at the top. So women have been fed a lot of misinformation about how to exercise, but also they've been fed a sort of their operating system sort of revolves around this idea, whether they realize it or not, that exercise is for changing your appearance solely. And listen, exercise is actually for changing your appearance, but it's, maybe most importantly, it's for living longer and living better, right? And avoiding chronic disease, and being able to do cool shit. So that's another barrier. Another barrier is this idea that women are less than. And so, men definitely don't want to look or act like women. Okay. So we can talk about like how little boys are raised to deny like one whole aspect of their emotional spectrum to be more manly because the worst thing possible would be for them to seem womanly. And then women are taught that actually, you need to play this role of weaker, you need to play this role of smaller, you need to play this role of quieter. I think so that men can feel like they're in control and in charge, right? And so then we get afraid of like getting muscles. Okay, we get afraid of grunting, we get afraid of working hard, we get afraid of sweating, right? Because maybe it'll mess up our makeup or our hair, or the muscles will make us look manly. And then we don't actually fit society's construct of who we are. We're too big, we're too strong, we're too man like. Okay. And we get a lot of gender essentialism thrown in there in terms of like, this is how men and women should be, because this is what, uh, you know, the dominant beliefs around this the social organization are. So that's another barrier. And then there's always the barrier of access. Okay, so which that comes down to like how much time women have, but also to how much financial resources they have. Um, the pink tax, right? Products sold to women are marked up a certain percentage. And women are sold ineffective exercise programs, promised that they will achieve aesthetic results from said ineffective exercise programs that these ineffective exercise programs couldn't possibly create. You don't spot reduce. You don't get a lean appearance from exercise. Okay, you get a lean appearance from a calorie deficit, and you can get muscle from exercise, but you're not going to have this tone and sculpted look that we've been fed from just exercise alone. And you're certainly not going to be able to spot reduce fat through exercise, right? So, fat loss is systemic, and we tend to lose fat in certain areas of our bodies sooner than others. And that's genetically determined largely. I think maybe 100% genetically determined. I'm not sure on that. We can specifically increase certain muscle sizes, the size of certain muscles over others through, we're not going to get bigger thighs by doing bicep curls, for example. But if you want to sculpt, really what you're trying to do is grow your muscle and lose probably some subcutaneous fat. Women have been basically taught that that's what they're trying to do, but they've been sold ineffective exercise programming to do it. Um, yeah, so it's there's a lot there. I think probably the most insidious barrier, though, is this idea that women are exercising for appearance. It's really a very sad reason to exercise. It's a very uh, depressing reason to exercise if it's your only reason for exercise. A lot of people who start exercising for aesthetic goals realize that exercise actually helps them feel better eventually too. But if all we're ever told by the people selling us exercise is that we're doing this because um, our bodies are not good enough, they're not attractive enough, they're not up to snuff, up to standard, and that we're fixing ourselves aesthetically through exercise, that's just hopefully, going to change fully. I don't see it fully changed yet. It's getting better, but that's not a great way to get people to love and want to do exercise. It's a great way to get people to hate their bodies, though, right? And to engage in a lot of behaviors that are unhealthy as well.
It's certainly a way to continue making profit off of different potions and gadgets and kind of keep the hamster wheel spinning around. Um, so for women who they I think they see some of the positive messaging around, strength training. They understand that, the benefits of it regarding osteoporosis and the importance of maintaining muscle mass and maintaining, lower body power production, all these benefits, that we talked about off camera as well. Even if they make that mental leap, they said, I want to start engaging in strength training. There does seem to be this sort of, I don't know, this aura of fear. Like I think a lot of the messaging around strength training, whether overtly or something that's just sort of been absorbed, is this idea of fear, of danger. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about why you think that is, and the ways you try to address it.
Yeah, I think that. Number one is that fear sells. So if we're operating in a capitalist system where uh, the people, with the microphone are also stand to profit from the message, then we're gonna probably hear a lot of messaging um, that is aligns with like effective marketing. Okay, so fear sells because we want to make sure we're safe as people, you know, negativity bias. We're always looking for threats within the environment, and we're more likely to spot what we perceive as threats over, positives or benefits in the environment. So basically, number one, let's not die. Okay, let's priority number one, because if we die, then we can't get any benefit. So if you sell people on this idea that exercise is inherently dangerous and that you have to be careful, a couple of things happen. One, they pay attention. Two, they start to see you, the messenger, as someone who possibly has the, solution to the danger, right? Like, that I'm in danger. And I'm going to associate that message with the fact that, yeah, I have been hurt while exercising. And yeah, I do have these aches and pains. And like, maybe it's connected to the fact that I'm not doing this correctly. And maybe because you notice this, you have, possibly a solution to that. You can help me do it correctly. So I think what happens then is that fear sells, but also um, it creates a narrative that then positions uh, maybe the person with the message as this authority in how, not to get injured. So don't do it this way, do it this way. Or, this way of doing the deadlift will blow out your back. So now don't do the deadlift. That's a bad exercise. Do this, resistance band exercise instead. Or, probably some overly complicated way of, underloading your glutes. Like this is preferred to the deadlift because the deadlift is dangerous. Um, I think that there is perfectionism woven throughout this as well, that like if we don't do it exactly right, it doesn't count. All or nothing thinking. If we don't do it, you know, exactly right and this much, um, making mistakes, getting it wrong, having it look a little sloppy, or doing, less than what we were told we were to do, it just doesn't count at all. It's not even worth trying. And so I think that that is probably a combination of like fear, um, s- I will call it stealing agency from the mover, right? And the teacher or the coach positioning themselves as the arbiter of like what is good and bad movement, of the source of safety, of the source of choice, that you can make about how to move. Like, I'm going to tell you how to move. You don't get to choose how to move, right? And then also this idea that it's all or nothing, right? Like, here's the protocol, here's the way. And if you're not doing it to this extent, don't even bother. It's wrong. Okay. I think that actually affects everyone, but maybe more so these messages, right? That permeate the way that the fitness industry talks about movement and positions certain personalities within the industry, right? As like, the people who have the information versus the people who don't. I think it hurts everyone, but I think that maybe it hurts women more. Um, and the reason is possibly because women just don't have as much experience. They might not have engaged in sports. They might not have engaged in intense physical activity as often as little boys and young men have. They might be coming more often from a sedentary background. And then also there is the vulnerability of uh, constantly being objectified physically, and being really reduced to an aesthetic ideal rather than a whole person. I think that the way that women have been conditioned within society has made them susceptible to manipulation, not because they lack intelligence, but because they're like all of us. seeking their place within this hierarchy. Okay. And we're all kind of trying to play a game where we'll be accepted. So women I think, are more likely to be comfortable with infantilization. They're more likely to be comfortable with misogynistic messaging. They're more likely to be, as opposed to what is the misogyny, and then there's the one that's like hatred of men. Like men don't.
Misandry. Misandry, yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
misandry, like yeah, I think women are, more likely to just let misogynistic messaging kind of pass over them as like, "Okay, yeah, this is just how women are spoken about." And so this idea of infantilization, basically, is this idea that, like, "Be careful, you'll hurt yourself. We need to protect you." We see this with little girls, right? Playing with little boys. Um, Little boys are taught like you cannot like be physical at all with a little girl because that's not how men behave when like physically, developmentally, the little boy and the little girl are pretty much on equal footing until puberty. Then there's the pregnancy, stage where women are notoriously uh, treated as though they, could lose the baby at any second, one wrong move. And then, of course, there's, women entering their older years where, we're constantly, I think, put into pillow forts. And so I think this makes us have less of maybe an embodied experience of what it means to be strong and to move with intensity and to move with force and to get hit, to fall, to hurt yourself, right? So hopefully that answers your question. I know I'm kind
No,
of
that's great.
probably speaking around the periphery a bit, but I don't think there's any one single answer, obviously, and I think that there's all of these um, competing messages and all of these very subtle cues that women are constantly taking in because they're women, because they're being spoken to and communicated to in a different way than men, that make it so that they might be more fearful of exercise of a certain type.
Yeah, I mean, one of the tenets of this podcast is that problems are complex. We try to avoid saying this is the problem, this is the solution, fix this in 3 easy steps. And it's a thorny, complex, multifactorial issue. I think you addressed it well. I was, in the past, I worked in public health and NHS in the UK, and it's interesting to see specifically when you see different cultures that are represented in the UK, how you can often really see almost more not exaggerated, but you see really stark versions of this in terms of how some cultures really have this idea of protecting women more. And there are some cultures that absolutely will not let women move at all during pregnancy, or even this idea you see it as well in old age for both men and women. This idea that once you're retired, you don't do anything. You're not supposed to move. You're not supposed to exert yourself. And so often people think they're trying to be helpful, but they can just exacerbate these issues or patterns. There's one thing I want to pick up on because you were talking about it. I think such an important theme, and it comes up a lot in your podcast. This idea of stealing agency. This idea of people engaging in an exercise class or working with a coach or a personal trainer or a teacher of some kind and feeling disempowered at the end of it. Whether it's due to like over cueing or whether it's somebody having a really top down prescriptive way of teaching or coaching. I mean, it kind of rears its head in so many ways. I was just wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about this idea of stealing agency and maybe some positive trends that you've seen in the industry of sort of turning that around, or maybe some things you try to do in your own practice to make sure that instead of stealing agency, you're helping to build agency and empower people that you work with.
Yeah, I think that in many respects, when the teacher steals agency from the student of movement, in whatever context that the person is moving, it's often done with good intentions. Like, I don't think there's the percentage wise too many teachers of exercise or movement that are, egomaniacs who are power hungry. Like, I think they would go into
Yeah.
different fields, right? 99.9% of people teaching movement have the best of intentions and are really just trying to help people engage in movement safely, right? Which is incredibly important, as well as to benefit from it and to get better at it, right? So, benefit from it, like, reap the health benefits of it, which is a part of moving safely, but also, to exercise and to strengthen your body and its systems, but also to enjoy it, right? So, there's a number of ways in which stealing agency might appear as being beneficial. Okay, so one of them is over cueing, which you mentioned, which is this idea that we actually flood our student with information about how to do the exercise at a rate that they cannot actually take in and use. And what happens is that we actually end up in many respects kind of controlling them like a doll as opposed to imparting movement skill for them to be able to use autonomously. We did a series of episodes a long time ago on the Movement Logic podcast called The Cues We Use, in which we talked about the motor learning research around cueing and what it actually means for someone to motor learn rather than motor perform. Okay, so the difference being motor learning means you can do it without the teacher. You can go home and do it because you learned it. Motor perform means you can't do it unless the teacher's in the room guiding you step by step. And something that happens when we over cue, we steal agency, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like we're being helpful. But what happens is we're actually encouraging motor performance. So this, command and obey type relationship. Put your foot exactly here. Put your hips exactly here. Straighten this knee, bend this knee, exactly this amount. Move at exactly this tempo. Keep your spine in exactly this alignment. Breathe in when you do this movement. Breathe out when you do that. Okay, and so it becomes very controlling. But when you look around the room, everybody looks great because everybody's doing the same thing at the same time, and everyone kind of looks homogenous in their ability to do it. And so, as a teacher, you get this positive feedback of like, I'm helping everyone do this correctly. And then by correctly, we often then make the jump to safely because we associate, and this is that button in our brain, right? We associate things looking a certain way with being healthful, right? Or non-injurious, which is a big mistake that we make, right? We can't look at someone and based on their appearance know that they're healthy. We can't look at someone do a movement and based on how they do it know that they're not going to get injured, because the mechanisms of health and injury aren't things that we can often see. Okay, so we think we're being helpful. We're actually preventing them from learning the movement, which is, I think, what every movement teacher ultimately hopes. At least it's one of their priorities. Is like, I want you to learn to do yoga. I want you to learn to deadlift. I want you to learn to, a 300-meter hurdle or whatever it is you're coaching. But we get in our own way because what motor learning research shows is that actually less feedback, right? Fewer cues that are external, right? That are task-based and fewer in number, as well as feedback given after the person performs the movement, right? Delaying feedback, that these are more effective ways to actually promote motor learning. Lots of cues about positioning the body in a certain way in the moment as the person's moving are actually more so ways of encouraging motor performance. And so just learning these little tips and tricks around cueing movement can be very revolutionary to your actual ability to help people learn movement. Another way we steal agency is that we don't ask permission, right? We step into people's personal space and we make assumptions about them personally, or we put our own narrative or stories onto them without asking, right? And without listening very much. So telling, students the story of their tight hips as being related to all of their stored emotions in their body or their past traumas is a narrative that we impose on people, right? Or walking up to a student and without asking, putting our hands somewhere on their body and just moving it into position. is a way of imposing ourselves physically on a student. Um, you know, using our body bias. Okay. So because I hurt my shoulder doing barbell strict presses, that means you're all possibly going to hurt your shoulder if you commit the mistake I committed. And so I'm going to use my body bias, the narrative of my own body and the way that I reasoned through my own injury. I'm going to impose it on you and make predictions about you based on that. I think these are all ways that we steal agency, and we do it while trying wholeheartedly to be helpful. So, this is where it's really important to learn about the science of movement, really, to learn biomechanics, to learn pain science, to learn about motor learning, so that you understand that because these buttons in our brain are so quick and easy to push, right? When you have a scientific background, and you don't have to be a scientist to have a scientific background, right? You can be a student who finds the right teachers and the right texts to read that make it useful to you, practical to you. You can circumvent that tendency to just go straight to the body bias, go straight to the over cueing, to go straight to the controlling or the imposition of, hands-on adjustments without, and you can go, actually, this is how it happens according to evidence. This is how pain works. Pain doesn't necessarily mean there's injury, right? Injury doesn't necessarily mean there's pain. Oh, this is how motor learning works. It's less about me and it's more about their discovery, right? It's more about creating the conditions for learning to happen than it is about imparting my knowledge, right? Or this is actually how this is how I help people truly feel empowered, right? Is that I give them choice, and I expand their options rather than narrow them. um, and I think that that is very freeing to a teacher of movement, because it's a lot of pressure to feel like you're in charge of the outcomes and you're in charge of the experiences and you're supposed to know about the past, the present, and the future of the students in your room, because only if you believe in a higher power. I mean, that's for a higher power, right? Uh, I personally don't believe in a higher power. It's really, from my perspective, magical thinking. Okay. I think we have to humble ourselves to the fact that we just don't know almost everything about a student. And so then what we have to do is we have to enter into a conversation where most of the time what we're doing is listening and creating conditions for things to happen.
Yeah, and I steal a lot from progressive PE courses because I think in the last few years, I think physical education, especially with this emphasis on physical literacy and exactly like you said, exploration, discovery, thinking about creating the environment and creating the opportunities for people to learn rather than, focusing on this top down prescriptive, assumption. And the phrase you always hear is, try to be the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. And I think so many of the assumptions about in yoga teaching, but also in personal training courses and things like that, is feeling like one needs to be the font of all knowledge. And it's a really hard thing to shake, especially depending on what modality you're doing. Obviously, if you're like a parkour class instructor or something like that, sometimes that feels more relevant in terms of giving people opportunities to interact with the environment. Whereas I think when we're teaching a deadlift or Olympic lifting or something like that, sometimes one has to be very creative on how they allow people to not allow on how they give opportunities for people to explore and come up with solutions and self-organize in ways that make sense, for their body. I want to, as we only have a few minutes left, and there's really two more things I'd like to talk about. So I kind of like to shift and hone in on talking about, I think what you've identified is there does seem to be this industry around menopause that's really emerged in the last few years. And I know there's a group of figures who call themselves the menopausy. Um, and that's kind of sort of a broad group. My final two questions, and I'll ask one and then I'll restate the other one, is what are some of the most common myths that you see, that you hear around training specifically to improve bone mineral density and quality, or considerations around low bone density? And that's really my first question. I'd like for you to go on that, but then I also want to finish up talking about your barbell course as well, and just a little like some of the lessons you learned along the way, because creating your own course is really daunting. And no matter how well you plan and no matter how much experience you have, you're always going to have these aha learning moments when you actually start doing it. So for the first bit, I just want you to kind of talk about some of the myths, the recurring myths, or maybe oversimplifications about training around osteoporosis and osteopenia, or for the purpose of bone mineral density.
Sure. Well, the pendulum swings wide, and I'm going to say it again, especially when it comes to exercise prescription for women, and when we're in the realms of osteopenia, osteoporosis. We're not just talking about women, obviously, because men can also, acquire that disease. But for the most part, this disease affects women more so. So the pendulum, when I, first learned of osteoporosis and osteopenia, probably in my early 20s, because I was an acting major. I did not major in any type of science. I was an artist for the early part of my adult years. So I encountered it when I started teaching yoga, and the idea was that we should never flex our spine, that we have to basically limit the directions in which we move our spine if we have osteoporosis of the spine. But I mean, that wasn't even made clear to me. As a yoga teacher, my thought was, okay, if anyone has osteoporosis, they really shouldn't be taking my class. They need to only exercise under the guidance of a physical therapist, and they definitely should never flex their spine, right? So, okay, basically just an atmosphere of fear, fragilization, caution. Okay. Now, sometimes that is warranted if someone's T score is considerably high, right? So their standard deviation uh, is, for example, much lower than a normal healthy spine, and they're truly fragile, like they're truly at risk of osteoporotic fracture. I want to make sure that I'm, also transparent in the fact that I'm not a clinician, I'm not a doctor, and so I'm not an expert in this disease progression, but I do know that there is severities of osteoporosis in which it absolutely is appropriate that someone is only working with a clinician in a particular limited number of movements.
What
Okay,
sort of
but
oh,
there are different degrees of osteopenia, osteoporosis, uh, and the fragilization of people with this disease, just um, as you know a catch-all for everyone, is harmful, because exercise is one of the main ways that we can improve the, the outcomes of this disease. So if we're constantly making people fearful of movement, right, we're probably increasing sedentarism and increasing the rate of bone loss, right? So I wanted to say this is never a black and white, like, you don't have to worry, you have osteoporosis, you're fine, you can just do what everyone else does all the no, not necessarily. It depends on the person, the diagnosis, the severity of the disease. But I know you want to jump in here for a second. I just want to say that I think that that's kind of where where I started in my understanding of osteoporosis. Now, the pendulum has actually swung a little too far in the other direction, but I can talk about that after you, if you wanted to say something.
I do also want to talk about the swing and the pendulum, because that's always
Okay.
important.
Yeah.
I mean, for
Yeah.
you, kind of heuristics, and with the caveat, this is not medical advice or anything.
Yeah.
If you're working with someone with various T scores, at what point do you think, I really need to refer this person to a clinician or a specialist? This is really outside my scope of practice now.
Well, if someone is coming to me with T scores, my first question is, has your doctor approved you to exercise? Like, are you approved for exercise? Have they said it's okay to strength train? And if the person says yes, and I'm like, all right, let's go.
Cool. All right.
And I'm gonna treat you then like a probably beginner to strength training. Okay. And that's how we're gonna do this. If there are any contraindications, okay, I work with people on Zoom, right? Predominantly. I have one local client here. If there are any contraindications, like I can't do this type of movement or this type of, I want a PT involved. All right, Sarah's on Movement Logic team, right? So she gets those emails. Like, okay, this person's got T scores and concerns and contraindications. Send them to Sarah. Okay. She's going to talk through these types of considerations with these types of people. Okay. But I'm always going to defer first to the clinician and the team of clinicians that this person is consulting around, what is safe and unsafe first and foremost. If they're safe to exercise, then okay, let's go. Let's begin at the beginning and let's treat you like an individual because ultimately that's really what you are is an individual. Okay. And so yeah, hopefully that answered your
Yeah, yeah. Let's
question.
talk pendulum.
Um, okay, pendulum. So then the pendulum is thankfully swang
Swing,
swung
swing,
in the
swing,
other
swing.
direction. It swang in the other direction. It swung in the other direction, and the message turned into you have to lift heavy. And you have to engage in high intensity impact training. And that is the only way that you're going to slow the rate of bone loss or increase, bone mineral density. And that is not supported by research. And everyone cites one single study to quote unquote prove their point, even though the study didn't quite prove that point. If you read it, which is the Liftmore trial. Liftmore trial was a fantastic randomized controlled trial. But the number one problem with the Liftmore trial is that the groups that it compared were so very, very different in the exercise prescription that they were given that you cannot conclude that moderate and lower intensity exercise doesn't improve bone mineral density through that comparison because it compared high intensity resistance training and impact training with an at-home exercise program that was probably closer to the loads you'd experience in Pilates and yoga, which is not even low intensity resistance training. Okay, because these are sets that are probably not taken close enough to failure to cause full recruitment and therefore enough stress placed on the bone, right? So, but there's research now, not just randomized controlled trials, but meta-analysis, right? Systematic reviews and meta-analysis showing that actually, based on the body of research that we have out there, based on all the randomized controlled trials and non-randomized controlled trials, so there's a problem with research quality in this arena, which we can talk about. But based on a large body of evidence, actually moderate intensity resistance training seems to be actually most effective for the most common sites where we experience osteoporosis. Why is that? Well, it's possibly because there's just more evidence that's looked at moderate intensity resistance training than there has been looking at high intensity resistance training. And that comes down to this idea that people with osteoporosis can't engage in high intensity resistance training because their bones are too fragile, right? Which is that first place where the pendulum started. So we need more research. We need more high quality randomized controlled trials that last for at least 6, ideally 8 months. These are really expensive studies, first and foremost, and very difficult to conduct. It's very difficult to get a large enough group of people to power the study to commit to an exercise program for 8 months, right? The Liftmore trial did it, which is why it's such a phenomenal data point, but it's just one paper. We need hundreds, ideally, more than one. Okay, so there's a systematic review with meta-analysis by Kistler-Fischbacher that we did an entire episode about called "Does It Have to Be Heavy?" It's currently one of our most popular episodes, and it's where we actually took a look at our own beliefs and messaging. Movement logic used to promote this idea that it has to be heavy, that we have to engage in impact training and we have to engage in high intensity resistance training in our older years, right? When we're perimenopausal and menopausal, in order to decrease the rate of bone loss and improve bone mineral density. And then we encountered some scientists uh, saying the opposite, right? And sharing the research. And we looked into the research and we're like, well, shit, it's true. And one of the reasons we changed our message because there's actually evidence showing that moderate and even light resistance training can improve bone mineral density. And there is simply not enough research, high quality randomized controlled trials conducted on enough women looking at the effects of high intensity resistance training. And we don't know yet, actually, right? Like we just need more information. So we changed our message. And we looked at in depth at this Kistler-Fischbacher review and meta-analysis, which the senior author on that was Belinda Beck, who is the lead author on Liftmore. Okay, and we looked at how actually there are many roads to Rome. Okay. And so we can actually stop narrowing people's options, and we can start to expand them and say simply that you should be engaging in resistance training consistently, following a program, and your sets, right? The series of repetitions that you string together of the exercise that you do, they need to be challenging. They need to be tough. It looks like impact training, landing and experiencing impact through your bones is also effective for improving bone mineral density. Um, but you can get some of those effects by engaging in aerobic activity. You can get some of those effects by, engaging in moderate intensity impact activity. So it's just not so simple. It's so much easier to sell a simplified protocol, though. It's so much easier to say, these are the rules. They're black and white. You have to lift heavy. Oh, guess what? I sell a program about that. These are the rules. You have to engage in, this amount of plyometric activity at this intensity. Oh, by the way, I also sell a program about that, right? Notice like, people that are promoting these messages for, certain types of health outcomes, whether it's bone mineral density, muscle mass, body composition changes. If they're promoting one way of doing it over everything else, what are they selling? That's the question, okay? Now, it's true that there are ineffective exercise interventions for improving bone mineral density, and that research bears this out. Yoga is ineffective. Pilates is largely ineffective. Walking is ineffective. Okay, it's important also to recognize that there are ways of exercising that are, yes, beneficial, but not effective for specific goals. And then to identify the ways of exercising that are effective for those specific goals, but don't limit those options. Expand them, share all of them. Because like 20% of people exercise. Okay, so 80% don't. So you're going to take the majority of people not exercising and then limit options for them. They're not even exercising. That's a terrible, terrible thing for public health. And unfortunately, it is what happens when people who have a microphone and an audience and money to make. It's unfortunately what they do, right? It's their marketing hook is it has to be heavy, and here's why. And they'll cherry pick research. Largely, they're going to, if you ask them, okay, why do you think it has to be heavy? They will almost always cite the Lift More trial. It's one RCT. So that right there tells you that these people probably haven't looked very deeply into the literature, and they probably lack some amount of scientific background to be able to understand that just using one RCT for your entire brand model is probably not. And listen, I'm going to go ahead and admit that Sarah and I kind of did that. We were doing that. We were relatively new to the bone mineral density research, but then we expanded. We turned outward and looked and listened, and credible scientists were saying the opposite of what we were saying, and we didn't double down. We didn't go, oh, they're just, they just don't think women can lift heavy weights and they're just sexist and no, we went, wait a second. These are people who are experts in research and experts in exercise. What do they know that we don't know? Well, they cited in the copy of their Instagram post. So we pulled up the PMIDs and read the research, and we're like, well, shit. Guess we got to change our message, because we're not actually in this to only make money, although we, of course, have to earn a living. We're actually in this to share the best information that we have to actually help people. So this for us has meant changing our message. The pendulum has swung, right? And in the first position of the pendulum, I think it was an abundance of caution that actually leaned toward unhelpful and damaging, because it promoted fear and sedentarism for people with osteoporosis, when people with osteoporosis have a lot of benefit to glean from exercise, right? Especially osteogenic exercise, or the type of exercise that has been shown to improve bone mineral density. But then the pendulum swung all the way over to You should be lifting heavy weights. Okay, I'm not opposed to that message, but you can only lift heavy weights. That is also a harmful message because it takes options off the table, and it does it for an insidious reason, which is to oftentimes strengthen a brand narrative.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's something I'll probably speak with Sarah about as well. This almost this audience capture, or this sort of, once one becomes a brand, there's sort of so much sunk cost built into that, and the fear of changing one's message that, I think a lot of these figures do, especially if they've made their reputation on a specific message. It's so hard for them to pivot, especially if they've been fighting on social media and things like that. And I think it takes a lot of humility, and just I think, in a way, yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of integrity just to be able to say, hey, you know what, we kind of have to massage this now that better information has come out. One of the things I do want to talk about, and this kind of circles back now, is to the development of the course, because it is, developing a course, as I said earlier, as anyone who's ever tried, it's a huge endeavor. It's a huge endeavor, and there's always that, you always have things written down, and you have this perfect idea of how things might work, and then when it actually comes time to run the course and share it with people, you just start learning all this stuff on the fly. So you've been running this course for a while now, and like you said, you've updated some of your priors, and you've updated, the science as it comes in, everything, which is great. I just kind of want to know, like, what are some things you learned when you were first developing the course, when you first ran it? Like, what were some things that you didn't expect, or how have you improved on the course over time?
That's a great question. So we built out the program, we got people signed up, we taught it. And I think the number one thing I learned as a coach in the program was that you gotta let, and this comes back to the motor learning research, right? You gotta let people move. You gotta let them get it wrong, and you gotta let them work it out for a while. And the amount of feedback you give and the type of feedback you give needs to be individualized to the people in front of you. So I can see everybody's rectangle and I can actually see what they're doing. We work with people on how to position the camera, and some people need this feedback and other people need this feedback. And everybody can benefit from the feedback given to individuals, but when the feedback is targeted at the individual, that's when it has the most power to make the biggest change for that person. So that's number one. Let people move and watch. Kind of coming back to this idea of listen and watch and take in as a coach, rather than override immediately whatever it is they were going to do and are doing. Let them experience it. The way we designed the program is that they're not lifting heavy really until about month 4. So there's a good long on ramp of lifting light and moderate loads. And, sometimes, working with just body weight and or broomsticks, empty bars, things like that. Another thing I learned is that um, it takes a long time for people to get the buy-in when they haven't done any resistance training. And one of the best ways to get them buy-in is for them to feel and see results. So it's very important that the way that they're approaching resistance training is effective. And this is a much bigger topic than exercise technique. This goes well beyond what you can actually see. You can see someone perform a deadlift, you can see someone perform a squat and go, that's kind of inefficient. Let's try this. This could be a little bit stronger. Let's try this, right? But you can't actually see whether or not someone is working to a high enough level of effort at the end of the set as easily. There are some clues, right? Their speed of movement, right? The way they're breathing, maybe if you're in the room with them, but also, what happens to their technique at the end, right? And the look on their face sometimes, right? Um, you can't totally always 100% know if that was a tough enough set to make a change. Another thing you can't see when you're working with a cohort online is whether or not they're even recording their weight and reps and sets. Like, are they coming to each workout with a frame of reference of what they did last week, and are they kind of starting where they left off, or are they kind of always just guessing? how much weight to put on the bar this week, or what do I kind of feel like doing? And so this is where we enter into um, an exploratory conversation around why effort is important, how to gauge and measure and observe it, why recording your workouts in a workout log is important. What do we do with that information? How do we adjust our approach to strength training based on how we feel today, which is going to be different than how we felt on this day last week? Um, Additionally, what are some additional tools we can utilize, like lift under the heels for squatting, straps to improve grip strength? Maybe you don't need to use a barbell in this exercise, and actually, dumbbells are a better choice for you. Maybe we're not going to do the bench press. We're going to put you on the floor and you're going to do a floor press. You know, how can we give people a well rounded movement repertoire and history and experience and skill set to draw from, so that they're able to actually make decisions ultimately for themselves? And so this is where I think we go from teaching movement to being educators, right? To discussing kind of the ins and outs of resistance training and the various tools that we have to make sure that we see the results and that we're applying the loads effectively. But then also, how do we create community so that people feel like they're a part of something with other people, and that they can share their thoughts and stories and opinions and discoveries in a community type setting, because that's going to increase adherence, that's going to increase buy-in, that's going to increase the possibility and hopefully, their continuance of this work after the course is over, the possibility that they're going to go on and like do this program again on their own, join us again in another cohort, or go on to like we have people who are like, I hired a personal trainer, I continue to practice with my buddy from the course. We got a message a couple of days ago. This is my sixth time going through this course on their own with my accountability buddy that I got in the cohort that I signed up for. They're meeting on Zoom separately themselves to continue doing this work with whatever friend they made in the course. And so these are the types of ways in which we've enriched the course. We've also changed things like, we're not going to do 4 sets of this exercise. We're going to do 3, and we're not going to do this exercise. Actually, we're going to do this exercise instead. And actually, we need to add some more supplementary material to the course because people are missing this piece. I'm going to redo this demo video because actually I think that the technique is not quite clear and I need a better, and every single round we're making these types of changes and having these types of conversations. It's all just, based on what we're learning, Sarah and I, what we're seeing, the kinds of questions and issues that are arising as it evolves.
Yeah, it's great having a sort of living product or community. I think in the past, where when people would put things out, they'd be sort of static PDFs or obviously published books, and they sort of they became these like moribund texts that people almost created this like religious reverence around. And it's just so nice. One of the good things about living in 2026 is it's very easy to update your materials and improve things and reiterate as you go. And as much as I complain about the internet, it is amazing to be able to have, to help develop a community of people and feel like you're helping them, have them interact with each other and build up their sense of agency and see them go on to help other people. I think it really comes through in the way that you talk about the course. It's obviously really, really thoughtful. I think just a great resource if there's anyone who's, sort of thinking about this and trying to make sense of it all, having not seen it, but having heard you talk about it through hours on the podcast, I just feel like it's such a, obviously, you are trying to make money, but it's obviously just a labor of love, and I think that really comes through in the way that you talk about it.
Thank you. And it definitely feels that way. It is our baby. It is the thing that we consider to be sort of at the heart of why we're online and why we have a podcast and why we work together is all happening in the course, right? It's the change that's happening to everyone who participates in this course. And it's a physical change. It's a change you can see a lot of the times. People get more muscle on their body. It's a change you can see in terms of what people can now do that they couldn't do. But it's also a change you can't see but that is manifest through different choices and behaviors that these women start to make after they leave the course. Like they sign up for their local gym, they start teaching to their family and friends, right? They start coaching. My friend next door wanted to learn barbells, so I just had her come over and started working her. I was like, great, that's cool. And it's in how these women really most powerfully how they start to see themselves as people who are strong, as people who can lift heavy shit, as people who can stick to a program, as people who willfully step into the intensity of change making that is a part of resistance training, that has to be a part of resistance training on purpose for the sake of getting potentially bigger physically, for the sake of intentionally, getting stronger. For the sake of maybe giving their husbands a run for their money, right? Where like they start to go, oh, well, shit, like my wife can now actually deadlift my body weight. I'm not sure I could deadlift hers. So let me start strength training. Okay. Like we hear these stories. And a woman in some northern region is a skier, a downhill skier, and like beat her sons, her adolescent sons or her teenage sons in a downhill ski race. It was like gave us a before and after picture of her coming around the gates at like just way more horizontal, like way stronger quad, like these are the things Sarah and I really truly live for are these shifts in identity and um and this way that women that take our course they see themselves in this new light that expands um what it is that they think they can do and then what it is that they go ahead and do.
That's great. Laurel Beversdorf, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew. This was a really wonderful conversation and a pleasure speaking with you. You're very good interviewer, in my opinion, because you just let me talk and talk and talk and talk. Like I'm just gonna
You've got
go.
good stuff to say. That's why I got you on.
You're a great listener, and I love the questions and I love the direction you took it in. So thank you so much.
Day, night. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
Okay, so that was Laurel Beversdorf. I hope you enjoyed that one. I thought it was really good. I really enjoyed the conversation around agency and messages that can help empower people versus sometimes practices that can disempower people. So if you did enjoy that, then keep your ears open because we have an upcoming interview with Dr. Sarah Court, physiotherapist, and she is the other half in movement logic. And the interview I have with her, I think, is really complimentary. If you do enjoy these podcasts, please be sure to say something positive, either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Obviously, we always like whatever it is, the 4 or 5 star review, whatever the max number of stars is, but be honest. And always really appreciate it if people write comments as well, because it's nice to get feedback on that. All right. Well, until next time, thanks.